Hello, I'm Sophia, and this is The World Unpacked. In this episode, we're talking about great power competition in the Middle East and North Africa. The United States, Russia, and China are all seeking to extend their influence here, but the ways that they're engaging with varying degrees of success are as complex as the region itself. This week on the show, we're digging into the data. Trade and foreign direct investment, arms exports, military deployments, they all tell a story of shifting alliances, economic competition, and strategic maneuvering. And they raise important questions about how the US, China, and Russia are shaping the future of the region. Is American dominance in the region fading? What do Chinese and Russian spheres of influence actually look like? And how are the countries of the Middle East and North Africa navigating this complex new web of great power competition? To help us unpack these trends and questions, I'm joined today by my brilliant colleague, Amr Hamzawy, Senior Fellow and Director of the Carnegie Middle East Program. Together, we'll explore how the United States, Russia, China fit into the geopolitical landscape in this dynamic region. Amr, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sophia. A pleasure to join you.
Great. So, Amr, we're talking about this today because you recently published a digital feature on this subject of great power competition in the Middle East and North Africa. I'm curious, before you set out to do this project, what would you say was the prevailing narrative on great power competition in this region?
Yes.
And why did you want to dig deeper and undertake this research now?
Yes, this is a great question. The prevailing narrative has been consistently throughout the last, I would say, 4 to 6 years, has been a narrative about retreating U.S. influence in the Middle East and North Africa en bloc at large, about a rising Chinese role and Chinese influence, disruptive Russian role, not only in Syria, but everywhere across the region. And scholars were pointing to Russia in Libya, Russia in North Africa, Russia in the Sahel region, a neighboring region to North African Arab-dominated countries. The narrative has been a narrative of a retreating U.S. and a rising Chinese and Russian role and influence in the region. What seemed to me and to my colleagues at the program not as convincing was once we were digging into the details of what exactly is happening on the ground. How does trade look in the Gulf? Is the Gulf trading only with China, or is it still trading with the U.S. as well? What is Morocco doing? Is Morocco trading more with China as opposed to its very strong trade relations with the European Union? Once we started digging even into military deployment, into arms sales, we were getting into a complex picture that actually evades the simple narrative of a retreating superpower and emerging contestation from China and Russia that goes in a one-sided direction. So to highlight and showcase the complexity of the picture we were looking at, we started digging into the different buckets of data you were just referring to.
Okay, fantastic. So I want to use some of our time to just dig a little bit deeper into each of the regions. And I would encourage, of course, our listeners to check out the whole project because we can only skim the surface here. But if we're talking about regional dynamics and maybe starting with the Mashreq or the Middle East and Israel, that region, this is a region that's faced a lot of violence and volatility in the last decade, especially with the ongoing war in Gaza. Your research suggests that today China has emerged as a key trading partner in the region, and public opinion reflects towards a growing favorability toward Beijing. Meanwhile, or perhaps that is related, you'll tell me, China has avoided involvement in security matters in this sub-region. So how would you say this Chinese role compares with the role of the U.S., traditionally very predominant, and Russia in this region?
The U.S. continues to be in the Mashreq countries, and we classify the Mashreq countries including Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Palestinian territories, and Israel. And I believe it's a way of transcending the different sort of usual suspect distinctions you have between Arab and non-Arab countries in the Mashriq. So we're trying to bring together what is actually together in terms of how it impacts citizens' lives, all the way from citizens' simple questions into geostrategic realities. So in these countries, the U.S. continues to be the most dominant superpower. If you look at the level of military deployment, the U.S. continues to sustain in Iraq, in Syria, in the Mashriq region in general by amassing military tools and military power since the outbreak of the Gaza war in October 2023. You clearly see the U.S. as the only military superpower operating in the region. It's actually the U.S. which has consistently interfered in different ways to maybe minimize the risk of the conflict, of the war in Gaza spreading beyond Palestine and Israel into neighboring countries, Lebanon, Syria. It's the U.S. which has tried to contain the influence of different non-state actors like the Houthi rebels in Yemen, or different Iraqi militias trying to interfere and meddle in the Israel-Palestine conflict unfolding in Gaza. It's primarily the U.S. which has used its military might and military power to respond to that. China has not, and Russia has not. In fact, even the level of Russian military activities in Syria has been declining in recent years. So it had a tipping point. It reached a tipping point in 2014, 15, and 16, and since then it's been declining consistently. China is not a big player in terms of arms sales into the region. So if you look at it, Sophia, from a military point of view, it narrates, this sub-region narrates a story of a consistent U.S. dominance. It's not retreating, it's not fading away, it's not going anywhere. But then the region has other interesting facets to look at as well. And here we're speaking, apart from Iraq, we're not speaking about oil exporting countries. I mean, these are oil importing countries to an extent that they do suffer from big global shocks and big global crises, and regional events impact them. You look at, for example, tourism in Israel, highly impacted by the events since October 7, or in Jordan, or elsewhere. From an economic and trading perspective, here you get into a bilateral competition, not a trilateral competition. Russia does not play a big role economically, and not from a trade perspective. A bit of trade with Syria, a bit of trade with Iraq, but that is it. That's the extent of it. The two big powers on the ground are China on the one hand, the number one trading partner for Iraq, for Jordan, in fact for Lebanon and for Syria. For Israel, it's the second biggest trading partner. But the U.S. competes well with China, even with regard to trade. And once you move beyond trade and look into, for example, economic aid packages, then the U.S. becomes a big player for Iraq, for Jordan, and for Israel. And prior to October 7, for the Palestinian territories as well. It's, in fact, the U.S. which, beside or next to the European Union, which has been the biggest donor to the Palestinian National Authority. So here you get a bilateral competitive picture, a bilateral competition. Then you look at the geostrategic realities and what's happening, because this is the one sub-region which has been in turmoil since 2011. And then you see elements of the disruptive nature of the Russian role, primarily in Syria. It's related to the Russian role that the current regime of Bashar al-Assad continues to operate in Syria the way it has been operating throughout the last 10 years. It is Russian and Iranian support, and the support of Iranian-backed non-state actors like the Lebanese Hezbollah. So here's a picture of a Russian disruptive role, but that does not level up to making Russia a dominant superpower in this sub-region. It plays a role, and I would say even when you stretch it to a longer period of time and you look back to the role the Soviets were playing in this sub-region, it's pretty much still the same. The Soviets back in the 1950s, 60s, all the way to the 2000s, were more of a disruptive superpower, trying to find entry points to disrupt U.S. influence, to annoy the U.S., to distract the U.S., but that was the extent of it.
This is fascinating, and I want to get back to what this should mean for U.S. policymakers, because we talked about the favorability ratings that don't necessarily align with the level of involvement, perhaps, in the region.
Yes, because it's and here it's really about the U.S. and China, and it's quite striking when you look at recent public opinion surveys covering Mashriq countries, with the one big exception of Israel, in fact, because favorability ratings in Israel are leaning more toward favoring the U.S., especially since October 7, because of the Biden administration policy, the overall response of the U.S. to October 7 and the war which broke out. Away from Israel, however, China is on the rise in terms of how citizens view Chinese policies. And it's a reflection of the no-interventionist or the less interfering policy that China has been pushing forward, to focus on trade, to focus on economic dealings and wheelings. China does not even give economic aid packages.
Right, trade
China
rather than aid.
Primarily.
Yes,
and when you look at the details, I mean, it's not favorable trade conditions. I mean, it's not always in favor of the receiving country in the region. However, the fact that China is not engaged in the politics on the ground, is not engaged militarily, does manifest itself in favorability, higher favorability ratings. And that reflects, in fact, what we are analyzing right now in the program, the emerging Chinese soft power in the region. And this needs to be looked at by U.S. policymakers. China is becoming a competing soft power center. Arabs are going increasingly to Chinese cultural centers to learn Chinese. There are ongoing education at the school level as well as at the university level, exchange programs between countries like Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and if you move beyond the Mashriq into other regions, you get the same as well between them and China. So that emerging soft power is an interesting facet that needs to be looked at.
Moving on a bit to North Africa, particularly to Egypt, which plays a significant role in this region, often acting as a sort of bridge between the countries of North Africa and the countries in the Middle East. How does Egypt's unique position sort of influence its relationship with the major powers in this region, the US, China, and how do these countries sort of approach other countries of the region?
Right. I mean, the overall framing of Egypt's foreign policy aligns with the overall framing of U.S. interests and policies in the region. And it's a fact which I always remind everyone and remind myself of, because sometimes there are sort of differences, discrepancies, but the overall framing of Egypt's foreign policy in the region aligns very well with what has been the consistent U.S. policy toward this part of the Middle East and North Africa. So Egypt is a country that signed a peace agreement with Israel that is all in favor of conflict resolution measures, nonviolent conflict resolution, as well as peace agreements and treaties. Egypt has always mediated between Israel and different Palestinian powers, including the Palestinian Authority, including different Palestinian factions and movements. Egypt has always tried to come up with a security arrangement in the region that keeps stability in the region. The preference was for stability and peace. And that aligns well with U.S. overall framing for the region. And therefore, I continue to believe that the U.S. is Egypt's strategic ally number one.
Right.
Even when I factor in the rise of Chinese economic activities in Egypt, and China has been a big player in Egypt's economic development in recent years. China is the partner number one in Egypt's mega economic projects, the building of a new administrative capital city, big infrastructure projects, big maritime projects, investments in different key economic sectors, all the way from green economy to innovative public transportation projects. It's always, you will find China almost everywhere. However,
you're saying this doesn't trump the geopolitical
it does not,
alignment.
Exactly. It does not minimize, it does not undermine or diminish the fact that Egypt continues to look at the U.S. as its strategic partner. it's interesting, Sophia, to factor in with regard to Russia to understand the interplay. That Egypt, historically speaking, whenever it did not get from the U.S. what it was hoping to get, be it in terms of military collaboration, in terms of arms, in terms of diplomatic support, and some issues in some areas where we do have some discrepancies between Egypt and the U.S. For example, the management of the issue of the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam, the big dam on the Nile, which is quite worrying for Egyptian policymakers because of its impacts, potential impacts on Egypt's water resources. And the U.S. tries to strike a balance. Egypt expects more solidarity, more support. Egypt has always gone somewhere else, not to replace the U.S., but to try to signal to the U.S. that we can do some hedging as well.
We have options.
Exactly.
Yes, yeah.
So then you look at the years between 2014 and 2018, and you see a spike in Russian arms sales in Egypt. But this does not happen in a vacuum. It happened against the background of different U.S. administrations being reluctant to approve Egyptian demands and requests for specific arms. Then Egypt turned the other side and went to Russia, very similar to what the Egyptians used to do in the 1950s and 1960s as well. That hedging is part of the reality of bilateral relations between Egypt and the U.S., and Russia comes and Russia realizes the fact that it does not supersede the level of a country where Egypt looked to do some hedging and to get better treatment, better conditions from the U.S. That goes for arms sale, that goes for the big project which Egypt signed with the Russian government to build nuclear reactors in the Egyptian Mediterranean coastal line. It still remains within the same geostrategic configuration of the U.S. as our number one ally, but then if we're not getting what we're asking for, we look somewhere else, a phenomenon that happens elsewhere in the region.
Okay. I want to... So far, the role of China seems to not necessarily follow the narrative that you set out in the beginning of China rising up to become a competitor or even overtaking the U.S. in the region. And you're saying this is partly because they don't actually play on the same playground. They don't engage militarily. They don't do as much economic aid. But if we're turning to another region, which are the Arab League countries, then there surely you're going to tell me another story because there everybody knows China has built its first and for now only overseas naval base in Djibouti in 2017. There's an increasingly large footprint there, including militarily. So does this reflect for you in the data that you found in terms of China's economic and military strategy shifting in this region over the years and rising to a competitor?
To an extent, overall in the Middle East and North Africa, China has become an economic competitor, an economic giant, a trade competitor and a trade giant. China has been, in terms of FDIs coming to the region from China, a big player as well, still less relevant as compared to the U.S. as well as to the European Union, which is a superpower in the region that we have not looked at, but we will be looking at in the next phase. However, in the countries of in the Horn of Africa, yes, the picture is different because there China is becoming a military big power and a military big player. As you've rightly mentioned, Sophia, China built its first military base overseas in Djibouti. The level of military deployment unmatched elsewhere outside of China. There is a level of military interactions between China and some of the countries in the Horn of Africa, and I include Sudan, by the way, and non-Arab countries like Ethiopia, Eritrea, and yes, China is emerging in this sub-region to be a military big player.
And diplomatic player.
And a big diplomatic player. In fact, it's only China which does have diplomatic missions in every single country. In the countries we are researching, China has a diplomatic mission everywhere. Everywhere. The U.S. does not have diplomatic missions everywhere. However, that picture of an emerging competition between China and the U.S. needs to be cautioned at two levels. One of the impacts of the October 7 war has been its extension to the southern part of the Red Sea, right? I mean, the Houthi movement has been trying to disrupt maritime traffic, has been attacking ships, has been trying to disrupt the sudden entry to the Red Sea and to destabilize that part as well as the Horn of Africa. China, with its military base in Djibouti, with its military presence in the Horn of Africa, did not interfere and did not, in fact, wish to move beyond its traditional policy of free riding on U.S. security assurances and on U.S. security presence and U.S. security-driven interference. So it was, in fact, on the U.S. and European allies, primarily Great Britain, to a lesser extent other European actors, to amass naval power to stop the Houthis, which we have been seeing in the last month. China did not interfere. So the picture of bilateral competition needs to be cautioned. And one has to say that in moments of crises, in moments of regional escalation, China disappears. Secondly, diplomatically, and this is an extremely important point you're making, China has been, due to its public opinion favorability, high ratings, China has emerged into a big diplomatic go-to superpower as well. China mediated the deal between the Saudis and the Iranians to find an end to the civil war in Yemen. China has tried its hands in mediating in the Sudanese civil war. China has been trying to de-escalate and contain rising tensions between Ethiopia on the one hand and Somalia on the other hand, in the Horn of Africa. Has been trying to mediate, in fact, indirectly and directly between Egypt and Ethiopia as well. Two big players in this part of the world. Egypt with its strategic interests in the Nile Basin, and Ethiopia with its big assertive diplomacy in recent years. So we need to caution that maybe China is emerging as a military power on the ground, not translating it into geostrategic influence, but it's definitely using trade and economic ties to advance into a diplomatic powerhouse in the region, not always in conflict with the U.S., but sometimes in tandem with the U.S. For example, when it comes to Sudan and its civil war, the U.S. and Chinese interests are aligned, very well aligned.
Okay, so we're already seeing that for some subregions, there are clear leaders that dominate some areas, arms supplies, economic trade, but mostly your research does what good research does, which is to complicate the picture. So there are some leading powers, some countries where the division of great power influence are not as clear. That's coming up in the second half of our show after this short break. Thanks for listening to The World Unpacked from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. If you enjoy the show, make sure to check out other audio series and podcasts from Carnegie. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Now back to the show. All right, we're back. Amer, let's talk a bit about Turkey. Turkey is a really interesting case in terms of great power competition because, according to your research, Turkish economic and security ties with the three great powers, Russia, China, the US, exhibit sort of the most diversity, if you will, in the Middle East and in the North Africa region. So this sounds familiar to those of us who've looked into Turkey as a balancing power over the past few years. Can you tell us more about how this plays out in this region and how Turkey's relationship with the US, China, and Russia has evolved in recent years?
I mean, you have to allow me to step back just to offer a historical insight, which is extremely relevant to understand how Turkey perceives its role in the Middle East and North Africa.
Please.
The Ottoman past and the fact that Turkey used to be a superpower in the region, I believe, never disappeared from the collective memory of Turkish policymakers, no matter which political or ideological orientation they have. Turkey always looks at its role in the Middle East and North Africa as almost a superpower, a regional, but by default a superpower in the region. So it otherwise you wouldn't be able to understand why is it that Turkey has played such a key role in Libya in the last almost 15 years meanwhile, why Turkey is playing an important role in Sudan, why Turkey is trying to find an entry point into mediating between Israel and the Palestinians. why Turkey is a big player in not only Iraq, but in Iraq and Syria, in Gulf affairs in relation to Iran. So one has to keep in mind that Turkey, due to its past, Ottoman past, its big role in the centuries prior to the 20th century and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the big role is played in the Middle East and North Africa, continues to have this image of itself as a key and a leading power in the region. And therefore, it sometimes does deal and wheel with the superpowers from a place of reciprocity. So if the U.S., which is Turkey's number one military partner, not only due to the two countries' NATO affiliation, but even historically speaking, the Turkish military has been geared toward American weaponry and exports from day one after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. However, if Turkey is not getting what it's requesting from the U.S., it goes somewhere else. And of course, all of us followed the big policy discussion which was unfolding around Russian arms to Turkey, and the pressure which the U.S. applied to stop the deal, to freeze the deal. We are right now in the freeze the deal moment. We do not know what will happen, but this showcases the reciprocity with which Turkey operates in the region. With China and Russia, and let me start with Russia. If you look at Syria, for example, a neighboring country to Turkey, a neighboring country where Turkey has played with Russia and Iran a decisive role in the new power configuration since 2011 up until now. Of course, one can always say this is not a stable power configuration. It only has been allowing Bashar al-Assad to rule more and do more of the same of what we have been seeing in recent years, which has been at the cost of Syrian citizens. But Turkey is a big player, and it looks at Russia as a big player as well, and reciprocity is the name of the game. Very different than the way Egypt would be looking at China and Russia, or Israel would be looking at the U.S., China, and Russia, and so on and so forth. And with China, Iraq is a place where China and Turkey do a lot of coordination in terms of economic and trade interest and investment. So the big takeaway is that the diversity with which Turkey has been managing its relation with the three superpowers is a true reflection of the role Turkey sees and reserves for itself in the region as a big player, maybe the biggest player among regional actors, and that is backed by an economic power, by big trade interests, by a military presence in Syria, in Iraq, even to an extent in Libya, for some years at least. It's interesting as well to keep in mind that Turkey's interests in the region do not only align with the U.S., but there are elements of alignment with the U.S. in some places, but elements of misalignment as well. The two countries have never seen eye to eye when it came to Syria since 2011 and up until today. There are some differences with regard to Iraq. There's a big issue surrounding the Kurdish question and the differences between Turkish policies and U.S. policies. And the fact that Turkey has some misalignment with U.S. policies in different spots in the region has been leading Turkey into diversifying its foreign policy net.
Yeah, it's an opportunity there.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so Iran is another unique case, and I'm aware that we're racing through these, that we could have individual podcast episodes about each of these regions, but I want to at least briefly touch on Iran. We've seen the relationship with this country and China grow stronger in recent years, particularly under the weight of U.S. sanctions, of course. China is the clear leader, your research shows, in terms of both economic and security ties with Iran. But Russia holds some significant influence as well. So can you tell us more about Iran's strategic approach towards these two countries and how this is influenced by its relationship to Washington?
Right. I mean, Iran is a good contrast to Turkey. I mean, if Turkey's strategic interest and its overall framing for its Middle East and North Africa policy has been to diversify relations, trade, military, geostrategic agreements and alignments between the U.S., China, and Russia. Iran, for many different reasons, has come to see itself and its role in the region by definition, to be against the U.S. and U.S. allies. Meanwhile, now reduced to only Israel. But I need to remind your viewers to the fact that Iran used to perceive Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Arab Gulf countries as U.S. allies, and by extension as enemies as well. But Iran now sees its, and in fact since 1979, has always seen its role in the region by definition as opposed to the U.S.
Sure. Yeah.
And as a result, Iran has tried to build strategic alliances with what it has been perceiving as competing powers to the U.S. In the first decades following the Islamic Revolution of 1979, it was the Soviet Union followed by Russia. And with the emergence of China, especially in the last 10 years, and with a new assertive Chinese foreign policy and with the Chinese manifestation of power across the region, it has come to be China as well. So this is sort of a counterbalancing strategy that Iran has always pursued. Bring China in, bring Russia in, trade, arms, diplomacy to counterbalance the U.S. influence in the region. And then detach some of U.S. allies from the enemy list. So the enemy list is now reduced to the U.S. and Israel. But what used to be previously the extended enemy list with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, with Egypt even at a certain point of time, that is revised because I believe Iran has come to realize that it needs good relations with regional actors and that it makes no sense to have enemies everywhere in the region or to depend simply only on non-state actors, which are, if you look at Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis, are basically pursuing disruptive politics. This is not in favor of a big ally or a big regional actor. When you look at the details, Sophia, China is more key to Iran, to its economy, to its trade. China is the go-to place for FDIs, for investment in the Iranian economy, and it's the number one trading partner. So the real strategic partnership, the all-inclusive partnership, is not between Iran and Russia, it's between Iran and China. China is the most consequential big player for the stability of the regime of the Islamic Republic in Iran. Russia is relevant from a military point of view, and of course we see it, and it's based on reciprocity. It's not only that China is getting weapons from Russia, meanwhile Iran is getting weapons from Russia. No, Iran is also exporting weapons, drones, and
Russia is coming to rely on
exactly,
them.
And Russia is coming to rely on them. So it's based on reciprocity. Interests of Iran and Russia converge to almost an identical, to a level of being at an identical framing in Syria. Both of them are interested in keeping and sustaining the Bashar al-Assad regime. Both of them are interested in keeping the non-state actors, the different militias operating within Syria, but also in Lebanon and Iraq. So there's a high level of convergence in the Mashriq between Iran and Russia. So at the level of military relations as well as strategic convergence in one of the sub-regions, which is the Mashriq region, these two factors speak for the importance of Iranian-Russian relations.
ties,
But it's actually China, which is the big player. And therefore, when Iran needed a mediator with Saudi Arabia, it was China, which was brought in, not Russia. The negotiations did not happen in Moscow. They happened in Beijing. The deal was signed in Beijing, based on which the Yemen civil war, I wouldn't say has come to an end, but at least has come to be at a lower intensity and at lower violence levels throughout the last 2 years.
Again, China as a diplomatic player, which sort of brings me to the next stage of our conversation, where I want to get you to talk about implications for policymakers a little bit. So, of course, throughout this conversation, we have seen how much nuance your research provides to the prevailing narratives that we mentioned early on. But how should U.S. policymakers adapt their thinking about Washington's role in these different regions Are there specific areas where U.S. strategy most ought to change? I mean, one thing that struck me was you're mentioning the diplomatic missions and China's growing diplomatic role. What can the U.S. do? What should the U.S.'s objectives be faced with the picture that you're painting here?
Yes, I mean, this is a great question, and I believe, and I am coming to it based on conversations which I've been conducting with U.S. policymakers as well, and I believe they are aware of the changes that need to be introduced. But if I am to sum up and put these changes in two big buckets. Number one, I believe the U.S. needs to come to terms with the fact that agency on the ground, that regional actors on the ground are entering into a new phase where governments in the Middle East and North Africa have come to realize that they can go shop around for arms, for trade relations, for FDIs, for security assurances. And we are no longer, even when we're speaking about traditional U.S. allies, with the one exception of Israel, if I speak about Turkey, if I speak about Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Egypt,
they all have options.
They have options. And their options extend beyond what used to be the case, especially between 1990, 1991, the collapse of the former Soviet Union, and I would say up to 2014, 2015. It's a changing regional geostrategic environment that we're looking at. They have options, and the U.S. Policymakers need to realize that this is impacting the policy behavior of Middle Eastern governments, and it's impacting how geostrategic realities are being discussed as well. So that's number one. The second big bucket is the U.S. needs to do a better job in publicizing the good work its diplomatic missions do, its educational missions do, its economic cooperation do on the ground, the economic aid. I mean, the U.S. has been a key donor to different countries in the Middle East and North Africa, and U.S. economic aid packages have resulted in big advancements in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in the Palestinian territories, in Jordan, in Yemen prior to the civil war. They need to do a better job of publicizing what their economic aid packages have achieved in these countries in terms of advancements in the educational sector, in the healthcare, even in sanitation in some places in Jordan, Egypt, Yemen, and Morocco. So
what is the problem here with publicizing it? Is it sort of overwritten by the military engagement?
I believe so. Yeah. I believe so. The level of military activity has been always disruptive in terms of its impacts on public opinion favorability. It's been the
headline story.
It's been always a headline story. Yeah. And then secondly, in moments of regional crises and regional wars, citizens look around and see, well, the U.S. silent on the continuation of the Gaza war up until today. The U.S. not doing enough in the way Arab citizens, I would say Turkish and Iranian citizens as well, perceive the unfolding events in action, in decisiveness of the U.S. side. The resulting impact is a hijacking impact, that the good work you're doing diplomatically or in terms of educational exchanges, in terms of economic aid packages, in terms of infrastructural aid that has been going into too many different countries in the region, it's hijacked by what is in the news headlines. It's hijacked by the big politics and its impact on citizens' awareness and citizens' perception. So the U.S. Needs to factor in a structural fashion the fact that countries have options, more options than they used to have in the years between 1991 and up until a few years ago. And secondly, they have to take public opinion favorability ratings extremely seriously, because even Arab policymakers or Turkish or Iranian policymakers and Israeli policymakers are no longer doing politics in a vacuum. Social media trends impact them, even as much as they dislike them. They do impact them, and they impact the way they do policy, and they impact the way they reach out to different countries.
And it limits the sort of different ways the U.S. can engage in the region in the future. And I can see U.S. policymakers finding this unfair. They're being held to a different standard, maybe in the region than Russia and China are. But you are saying that it is a reality that they have to engage with.
It is, and of course, I mean the big beneficiary is China, not Russia. I mean China has in fact mastered the game of free riding on U.S. security assurances and U.S. military intervention. Once again, look at the southern part of the Red Sea, which is decisive for Chinese trade. I mean, not only oil goes to China from the Gulf that has a different route, but Chinese exports to Europe, I mean, they all go through the Red Sea to the Suez Canal and to the Mediterranean. And in spite of the huge impact of the Houthi disruption on Chinese trade, China did nothing. It has been consistently interested in free riding on the U.S. role. And on the one hand, you see the free riding, and on the other hand, you see China speaking about peace and nonviolent conflict resolution measures and a big no to military intervention, and benefiting from this diplomacy and these statements in terms of public opinion favorability ratings, while free riding on the U.S. and the security role and the military interventionist policy the U.S. has to play sometimes.
Well, that brings me to a question I wanted to ask you about the future of this research, really the future of how you're going to look at this region. I didn't, in the beginning of our conversation, pick you up on your choice of superpowers, your choice of great powers, Russia, China, U.S. I think you've explained it makes sense because that is the prevailing narrative focuses on these three. But, I mean, from what you've been telling me and what I've been reading, people could take issue with including Russia in this lineup, and people might ask you why other players like the European Union that has come up a few times isn't included. So do you think that these three powers we're still going to talk about these three powers 10, 20 years from now, or are there others that are emerging?
So you're extremely right in terms of saying where is Europe, where is the EU, which has been a trading and economic giant in the region since the 1980s consistently. It's been a big trading and economic partner for most countries in the Middle East and North Africa since the 1980s. The EU previously had more vibrant diplomatic roles in terms of mediating in regional conflicts, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in previous times, unlike the picture or the appearance of the EU as of now, of course, for different reasons that you know more about, European domestic politics, right? Yes, exactly, extremely absent. Ukraine, the war, and so on and so forth. But yes, I mean, it is very legitimate to ask where is Europe, and the simple response is this has been phase one, and phase two will definitely have Europe be included. However, why was Europe not selected for phase one? For the simple fact you were just mentioning right now, Europe has been absent from big regional conflicts consistently since 2011. This is not a manifestation of October 7 and the Gaza war. This has been a consistent manifestation of European policies in the Middle East and North Africa since 2011.
There is no European policy. There are individual countries.
Exactly. And some European countries tried their hands in the Libya civil war for a short while and then retreated. Otherwise, European countries and Europe at large has been missing from regional conflicts. When you look at conflicts, it's the U.S. primarily, which still shoulders the highest burden in terms of meddling through different regional conflicts. And this is a region which has been in turmoil consistently in the last almost 15 years, followed by China, followed by Russia. The second question you're raising is as interesting. Why Russia? And it's exactly for the same purpose. No matter where you look in terms of conflicts, you will see an element of a Russian interference or a Russian disruptive role.
It's the two sides of the coin.
Exactly. It's what Russia has been doing in Libya. It's their support of non-state actors, of militias in Libya, in Sudan, in Yemen, and elsewhere. It's Russia undermining stability in different Mashriq countries to annoy and disrupt U.S. influence, to create more of security risks for the U.S. So while Europe is missing from regional conflicts, Russia tries consistently to be present in regional conflicts. And the gain is always should not be reduced to what Russia is getting in these countries. It's a geostrategic gain in terms of disrupting, annoying, undermining, eroding the U.S. influence.
Sitting at the table.
Exactly,
Of the
and
great
sitting,
powers.
simply sitting at the table, which has been a consistent feature of Soviet and Russian policies in the region since the 1950s.
Amr, this has been fantastic. We could keep talking. I'm sure we will come back to these. At this point of the show, I'd like to ask our guests what book, what paper they would recommend to our listeners to better understand the issue. I mean, you feel free to just recommend the research we've been talking about or anything else that comes to mind.
So I would love to recommend, besides the research, we've been talking about a new edited volume that is coming out of Carnegie, I believe, in a matter of a few weeks, early October. It should be published, on Soviet and Russian policies toward the Middle East, which is an interesting set of articles looking at the historical side of how the Soviet Union emerged to be a player in the Middle East and North Africa, and how Russia, with all the differences between the Soviet Union and Soviet legacies and Russian realities today, how Russia is, in fact, continuing on the same path up until today in the Middle East and North Africa, to seek entry points in U.S. strongholds, to seek entry points to maximize its geostrategic global benefit, but not benefits in the region. Russia is not interested in higher levels of military deployment in the region beyond Syria. Russia is interested in disrupting U.S. influence primarily. So I would strongly recommend this new edited volume that is coming out of the Carnegie Middle East program very soon.
Fantastic. I can't wait to read that. Amr, it was a pleasure to have you on the
Thank you
World
so much for
Unpacked.
having
We
me.
look forward to having you back in the future.
Thank you so much for having me, Sophia.
Thank you.
It's been great. Thank you.
You have been listening to The World Unpacked, an audio production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at thecarnegieendowment.org. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, Mira Varghese produces the show, and Clarissa Guerrero is our executive producer. I'm Sophia Besch. Thanks for listening.